Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story. The night stretches quietly over the silent empires, where power moves in silence and entire fortunes are built far from the light. Tonight, we turn to Frank Lucas, the disciplined mastermind whose calm precision and unconventional strategy redefined the criminal world of Harlem. His rise wasn't loud, it was controlled, calculated, and built on choices made in the shadows where few ever dared to look. Before we begin, tap that like button. We're aiming for 100 likes tonight, and share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support keeps these whispered stories alive in the stillness of the night. Now lean back, breathe slow, and let the story of Frank Lucas guide you deeper into the quiet. On a warm summer night in Harlem, long after the sirens had faded and the shop gates had rattled shut, an old man in a wheelchair sat by a window and stared at the city that had once whispered his name in fear. His hands, once steady enough to count stacks of money all night long, now trembled as he lifted a cup of tea. Outside, children laughed on the sidewalk, chasing each other under the streetlights, completely unaware that the man in the window had once controlled more money and more danger than they could imagine. People who passed that brownstone might have glanced up and seen only an aging face, the kind you forget as soon as you look away. They wouldn't know that decades earlier, unmarked cars followed him. Federal agents studied his every move, and whispered conversations in smoky back rooms circled around what to do about him. They wouldn't know that behind that quiet gaze were memories of fields in North Carolina, crowded streets in New York, dim corners of Southeast Asian hotels, and courtrooms where entire rows of police officers sat in silence as their names were read out loud. He had gone from barefoot boy to feared figure, from king of a hidden trade to a man wearing a prison uniform with his name stitched over the heart. He had seen people rise, fall, vanish. He had watched his own legend grow, twist, and return to him in movie form, half truth and half myth, while he sat in a dark theater, listening to strangers react to a version of his life. As the night deepened and traffic thinned, he thought about the first time he stole something because he was hungry. He thought of the first time someone trusted him with a small piece of crime, the first time a gun lay on the table between him and another man, the first time he realized that what he was building could not end well, no matter how carefully he planned. He knew that somewhere, in some neighborhood that looked a lot like the one outside his window, another kid might be staring at the same kind of hunger, the same kind of anger, and hearing the same dangerous promise. There is an easier way, if you're willing to cross a line. This is the story of how a boy from LaGrange, North Carolina, walked across that line and kept walking until there was no path back to the simple life he once dreamed about. He came into the world in the early 1932, in a corner of North Carolina that moved at a slow, dusty pace. The town was small, the days long, and the rules of race and class were written into everything. He grew up black in the Jim Crow South, where even as a child, he understood that certain doors would never open for him, no matter how hard he knocked. His family had almost nothing. He saw his mother stretch food that was already thin. He saw his father work hard and come home tired, with barely enough money to keep the lights on. There were days when the question wasn't what they would eat. It was whether they would eat at all. Hunger wasn't a rare feeling. It was a quiet shadow that followed him everywhere. As a boy, he watched white men ride through town in clean clothes and polished shoes, while his own shirts were faded and his shoes had worn out soles. His earliest memories of anger came from seeing his parents disrespected, pushed aside, and left behind by a system that treated them like they didn't matter. That anger mixed with something else, a promise he made to himself as a child that he would never be poor like that again. He didn't begin as a criminal mastermind. He started like many poor kids do. Small lies, small thefts. He took food when he could. He slipped things into his pockets and walked away, heart pounding, telling himself it was survival, not stealing. In his mind, the world had already decided he wasn't meant to have much. So when he grabbed something off a shelf, it felt less like a crime and more like revenge. But the South in those days was not a place where a young black boy could afford mistakes. Stories traveled fast. A boy accused of looking at the wrong person could face a mob, not a judge. Violence hung in the air, never far away. He saw and heard enough to know that if he stayed in that town, his options would be few. Work himself into the ground for almost nothing, bow his head and swallow his pride, or step into danger and hope he could run faster than fate. He also learned another lesson. Power belonged to those who broke rules and got away with it. He watched white landowners cheat his family and walk away smiling. He watched law enforcement ignore crimes when the victims were black. He watched people who followed the rules stay poor and desperate. Somewhere inside him, a thought took root. If the game is unfair, maybe the only way to win is to stop playing by the rules at all. As a teenager, he clashed with authority. School didn't hold his attention. Teachers saw a restless kid with sharp eyes and too many questions. Textbooks that talked about opportunity felt like jokes at his expense. He drifted toward trouble the way metal drifts toward a magnet. A fight here, a theft there, bad choices piling up. One night, after a particularly harsh encounter with a white man who made it clear that his life meant less because of his skin, he walked home with his fists clenched and a burning thought in his mind. I'm not living like this forever. That thought frightened him and fueled him at the same time. Stories from the north reached his ears like rumors from another planet. Harlem, they said, was a place where black people owned businesses, dressed sharp, walked with their heads high. The money was different there. The music was louder, the streets fuller, the chances bigger. Of course, nobody left out the danger, but to a young man who already felt trapped, danger in a city sounded better than slow suffocation in a field. He made his way to New York in the 1940 seconds, leaving behind the red dirt roads and wooden porches. The train station, the ride north, the first step onto a Harlem sidewalk, each moment felt like a door slamming shut behind him and another one creaking open in front. The city hit him like a wave. Car horns, crowded sidewalks, neon signs, street vendors, people yelling from windows and stoops. It felt alive in a way his hometown never had. Harlem in those days was complicated. On one side, it was culture and creativity. Jazz clubs, churches full of singing, barbershops humming with talk. On the other side, it was hustlers on every corner, numbers runners, street dealers, and shadowy figures who controlled what happened after dark. Money flowed through those blocks, honest and dishonest, often tangled so tightly you couldn't tell one from the other. Frank arrived with no real skills, few connections, and a bitter determination not to be poor. At first, he took whatever low-paying work he could find. Odd jobs here and there, unloading trucks, cleaning, small-time work that barely covered a bed and a plate of food. But he watched. He paid attention. He saw what kind of men walked past in expensive coats, diamond rings flashing under streetlights. Those men didn't clock in for shifts or punch time cards. They didn't bow their heads to anyone. People stepped aside when they walked by. Shopkeepers greeted them with respect, sometimes with fear. He saw them hand out cash without counting it. He saw them roll up in cars that looked like magic compared to the rusted vehicles back home. He learned names. One name he heard more than others was Bumpy Johnson, a sophisticated Harlem figure who moved between the world of organized crime and the community. People talked about him with a mixture of respect and caution. Some saw him as a protector, others as a danger, but no one dismissed him. His influence stretched across streets, businesses, and people's decisions. To Frank, Bumpy represented something huge, a black man who had carved out his own realm of power in a world designed to keep men like him small. It didn't matter then that the path was illegal. What mattered was that this man seemed to write his own rules. Frank wasn't the only young person in Harlem who looked at figures like that and thought, if I could just get close, if I could prove myself, I wouldn't have to be broke and invisible anymore. Hunger, pride, and the desire for respect are powerful forces, especially when they all live in the same heart. He started hanging around places where people in that life gathered. Pool halls, bars, street corners, where betting slips changed hands. At first, he was just another skinny kid in a borrowed coat, running minor errands, listening more than he spoke. He learned how the local gambling operations worked, how debts were collected, how money flowed up the chain. He saw his first real roll of cash in a back room above a shop, when a man pulled out a thick stack of bills and peeled them off for a small group of runners. The sight of that money, all at once, was like seeing another universe. It was more than his father would have held in a year back home. That image burned into his mind and never left. His early crimes in New York were small. He carried envelopes he knew he shouldn't open. He watched doors while deals went down in the next room. He helped move untaxed goods from one place to another. Each small act pushed him further away from legal work and deeper into an underground economy where everything had a price and almost nothing had a receipt. He also saw consequences. He saw men beaten for skimming money. He heard about people who disappeared after betraying the wrong person. He watched mothers cry on staircases when their sons didn't come home. The danger wasn't hidden. It lived out in the open if you knew where to look. It might have scared another kid away. For him, it had the opposite effect. Danger meant the game was real. Risk meant the reward was serious. And in his mind, going back to minimum wage jobs and cramped rooms had stopped being an option the first time someone handed him a payoff and said, "Good work." Over time, his persistence brought him closer to people who mattered. He made himself useful. He kept his mouth shut, did what he was told, paid attention to details. In a world built on trust and fear, reliability counted for a lot. He slowly became a regular face in circles that the average Harlem resident avoided. His connection to Bumpy Johnson is one of those parts of his life that would later be argued about, told and retold, polished into legend, questioned by critics. But from his own accounts, he eventually became one of the many young men who took orders from Bumpy's network, learning from older operators who had already survived decades in that dangerous space. Working in that orbit exposed him to a higher level of criminal activity, still mostly focused on gambling and local rackets at first, not yet the drug empire he would one day build. He saw bribes exchanged with a careless flick of the wrist. He saw envelopes passed to certain law enforcement officers who, in turn, looked the other way. He watched how influence worked. Who got protection? Who got warnings? Who got nothing? These early years trained him. They taught him how to read people. Who was weak? Who was loyal? Who would fold under pressure? They showed him the value of information and the cost of betrayal. They made him believe that if he could climb high enough in this world, he could finally achieve what he'd wanted since those hungry days in North Carolina. Not just money, but a feeling that no one could push him around again. He didn't know it yet, but the real turning point, the decision that would lead to his rise as one of the most infamous drug traffickers in American history, was still a few years away, waiting quietly in a future where a power vacuum, a foreign war, and his own ambition would collide. For now, he was still learning the rules of a game that would one day make his name echo far beyond Harlem's blocks. By the time he was in his 20s, he could walk down 125th Street and nod to people on almost every block. The barbers knew his face, the bartenders knew his drink, and the small-time hustlers knew enough to move aside when he passed. He wasn't famous yet, not even close. But he was no longer the hungry boy from North Carolina scrambling for coins. He had stepped into a different life. Working around Bumpy Johnson's circle was like going to school, only the lessons had nothing to do with classrooms. He learned how meetings really happened, not in big offices but in back rooms of restaurants, on quiet park benches, in the rear seats of parked cars. He learned that real power often spoke softly and kept its distance from the loudest rooms. Bumpy didn't treat him like a son, but he noticed him. That was enough. Seeing that sharp older man in carefully pressed suits, hearing him talk calmly while everyone else leaned in, left a mark. Bumpy showed that a person could be feared and respected at the same time, and that image took hold deep in Frank's mind. He watched how his older boss moved through Harlem. Bumpy might give money to someone struggling with rent one day and order harsh discipline for a betrayal the next. He went to church services and then, hours later, sat at tables where illegal deals were arranged. To many people in the neighborhood, he felt like a strange mix of protector and predator. Frank absorbed this contradiction and filed it away. The idea that a man could be both helpful and harmful at once. From that environment, he picked up a set of rules that would guide him later. Don't talk too much. Don't brag. Don't steal from the people above you. Pay who needs to be paid. And maybe the most important, real money comes from controlling the source, not from taking whatever someone else decides to give you. In those years, the illegal money in New York came from many places: gambling, loan sharking, protection schemes. Drugs were present, but not yet the roaring storm they would become. Heroin moved largely through routes overseen by Italian crime organizations, who treated black distributors as lower-level partners or easily replaced customers. Street sellers ran risks every day, But the largest profits stayed in hands far from the corners where the product was actually passed. Frank saw this clearly. He watched local dealers beg for higher quality supply or better prices and get turned down. He watched heroin that had already passed through several layers of markup get cut again before it reached users, lowering purity but raising danger. He listened to people complain about being squeezed from both ends, the suppliers above them and the police on the street. At first, he stayed mostly on the edges of that world. His early work revolved more around numbers, illegal betting, collections, and small enforcement jobs. But little by little, he understood that if he wanted to rise beyond middleman status, he would eventually have to step into narcotics. Even then, he sensed that heroin was different from gambling slips or untaxed liquor. Gambling took people's money. Heroin took their peace of mind, their families, and often their lives. He knew that. He stepped forward anyway. While he learned the trade, his personal life changed too. During trips to clubs and parties, often moving in mixed circles of Harlem regulars and visitors from Puerto Rico and other Latin communities, he met a young woman named Juliana. She was stylish, sharp, and ambitious in her own way. Over time, they became a couple. She liked beautiful clothes, jewelry, and the kind of life that didn't involve counting pennies. He wanted to provide that, not just for her, but for himself as proof that he had escaped the poverty of his childhood. Their relationship wasn't simple. His work meant odd hours, unexplained absences, vague answers about where he had been. Still, she stayed by his side, and he drew strength from having a home to retreat to when the streets felt too tense. They married, built a household, and eventually had children. In public, he tried to present himself as a provider, a businessman, a man who had made it out of nothing. Behind that image, however, his mind was busy with another question: how to move from small and medium operations to something far larger. The answer began to form in his thoughts as the 1,960 seconds unfolded, and the world far beyond Harlem grew more unstable. America went deeper into the war in Vietnam. Reports of soldiers fighting in jungles, of body counts on the evening news, of growing protests in cities and college campuses, reached even the back tables of the bars where Frank met his contacts. Along with those reports came something else. Stories of addiction among troops stationed in Southeast Asia, and of a region called the Golden Triangle, an area where the borders of Laos, Myanmar, and Thailand meet. Long known for large-scale opium and heroin production, for most men in his position, those were just distant facts. For him, they sounded like opportunity. While others focused on the dangers of the war itself, he thought about supply. If the purest heroin was produced in that region, and if the usual routes to the United States were choked with middlemen, what if someone went directly to the source? In 1968, Bumpy Johnson died of a heart attack in a Harlem restaurant. For Frank, that moment felt like an earthquake. The man whose shadow had stretched over so many streets was suddenly gone. The funeral was crowded with people from every side of his life: grieving neighbors, quiet men in tailored suits, women holding children who didn't fully understand why they were there. Standing among them, Frank realized that an entire structure of power was about to shift. With Bumpy gone, a scramble began. Different figures tried to fill the empty space, to claim pieces of territory and influence. Some looked to connect more closely with Italian crime families. Others tried to form new alliances within the black underworld. Frank made his choice. He would not be content to remain under anyone else's thumb, no matter their background. If he was going to risk his freedom, he wanted control. That decision brought him back to the idea that had been forming in his mind: direct contact with Southeast Asian producers. He had heard that a relative by marriage, Leslie Ike Atkinson, had built a life near American military installations in Thailand. Ike was an ex-soldier with connections to both local officials and members of the U.S. Armed Forces. In a time when uniformed planes and cargo moved constantly between bases, that network had potential. According to Frank's later accounts, he traveled to Southeast Asia in the late 1,960 seconds, leaving behind the cold winter streets of New York for a region heavy with heat, humidity, and the constant hum of a war in the background. Stepping off the plane in Bangkok, he entered an atmosphere that felt at once alive and tense. Soldiers on leave wandered the streets. Vendors called out from stalls. Neon lights flickered over bars and small hotels. In the distance, he knew, fighting continued. But in the city, another kind of trade took place. Money, luxuries, and drugs. He checked into modest hotels, not wanting attention. He met with Ike and began learning how the environment worked there, who to pay, who to avoid, where the local producers operated, which routes were watched closely by authorities, and which had blind spots. He took note of uniforms, checkpoints, and shipping yards, always keeping his main goal in mind, finding a way to bring high-purity heroin to the United States without passing through the usual chains. In his later interviews, he painted vivid pictures of traveling to remote farm areas, sitting with producers, and negotiating for massive quantities of product. He told stories of meeting a powerful supplier he nicknamed 007, of arranging shipments that would dwarf what local dealers in Harlem were used to seeing. Some of these claims have been questioned by journalists and investigators who examined his story years later. They argue that he may have exaggerated parts of his role, and that others, including Ike Atkinson, played larger roles in organizing supply routes. What remains clear, however, is that he succeeded in plugging directly into a Southeast Asian pipeline. Whether or not every detail of his version is perfect, he ended up with access to heroin far purer and cheaper than what was normally available in New York. He had done what he set out to do, cut out multiple levels of middlemen and move closer to the source. As for how the product traveled from Asia to America, he would later give several versions. The most famous involved hiding packets inside the coffins of fallen soldiers, using the most tragic cargo of the war as a shield for his scheme. This image, repeated in articles and films, horrified people and added to his dark legend. Yet some investigators who studied military records and shipping procedures have argued that the coffin story was likely overstated, if not invented. They believe the primary method involved using shipping crates, false compartments, and corrupt insiders along legitimate cargo routes tied to the military supply chain, still a serious crime, but different from the shocking picture he sometimes painted. Regardless of the exact mechanics, it is beyond doubt that he used the chaos of the war and weaknesses in oversight to move large quantities of heroin into the United States. Corrupt contacts in and around American bases, both in Asia and at home, played their parts. Boxes that were supposed to hold furniture, machine parts, or other mundane items sometimes carried something far more destructive. He returned to New York with a plan and the first shipments of high-level product. Back in Harlem, he was no longer simply another apprentice from Bumpy's era. He was now a man with something that others wanted badly: a direct line to a powerful overseas supply. From the start, he treated this as a long-term business. He insisted on high purity and consistent quality. He packaged his product under a brand name that would later become infamous: Blue Magic. On the streets, this label meant that what was in the package was stronger and more reliable than most of what could be found elsewhere. That reputation spread quickly, and with it, his influence grew. He did something else that set him apart. Instead of building a large, loose organization of random recruits from the city, he turned to people he felt he could trust. Relatives from North Carolina, close friends, people whose families he knew personally. He believed blood ties would reduce the risk of betrayal, and he wanted to keep his operation as tight as possible. He taught them to follow the same rules he had learned. Keep quiet, avoid public fights, never speak freely around strangers, and always remember that law enforcement was watching, even when it wasn't visible. He allowed almost no one from the outside to see the full picture of how the business worked. Most people only knew their small part: collecting money, passing packages, driving cars between locations. At home, he started buying properties and businesses in his relatives' names. He purchased a massive house in New Jersey, a farm in North Carolina, and other holdings. The money flowing in from heroin sales paid for a lifestyle that would have been unimaginable to the hungry boy in La Grange. Tailored suits, expensive cars, fine dining, and gifts for his wife and children. He also worked hard, at least in the early phase, to avoid attracting unnecessary attention from the police or rival gangs. He wore simple coats instead of flashy furs. He chose relatively plain cars when he drove around Harlem. He quietly helped some people in the neighborhood, paying hospital bills, covering funeral costs, giving money to churches, hoping to build a layer of loyalty and silence around his activities. But no matter how quietly he tried to move, the impact of his business was loud. The heroin that came through his network spread through Harlem and other parts of New York, then into New Jersey and beyond. Addiction deepened. Families suffered. Children watched parents change. Workplaces lost employees. And hospitals saw more people struggling to break free from dependence on the drug. He understood that harm. In later years, he would talk about the damage his trade did, admitting that he had made choices that destroyed lives. During the years of his rise, though, that knowledge did not stop him. He told himself that if he hadn't stepped in, someone else would have, that the demand already existed, that the system was rotten from top to bottom. Those justifications helped him sleep at night while the money piled up. For a while, it seemed to work. His product dominated the market. Rivals either bought from him or saw their sales collapse. He had what he had always wanted: wealth, power, and the feeling that he was no longer trapped by the poverty and racism that had shaped his childhood. In his mind, he had beaten a system that had been rigged against him. Yet the same things that built his empire high-quality product, a bold smuggling route, a tight organization, also made him stand out to people whose job was to notice patterns in crime statistics, seized packages, and sudden shifts in the underworld. Somewhere in an office downtown, and later in federal buildings in Washington, D.C., men and women studying charts and boxes of evidence began to ask the same question: who was behind this new wave? The answer would take years to find. In the meantime, as the 1,970 seconds opened, he was at the height of his power, still convinced that he could control the forces he had unleashed, still believing that careful planning and secrecy would keep him out of prison. He had no way of knowing that some of the very tools he used to build his empire, corruption, greed, and fear, would eventually be turned against him. In the first years of the 1,970 seconds, his days started early, not with an alarm clock, but with phone calls and quiet knocks on doors. Before most people in Harlem had finished breakfast, money was already moving toward him in brown bags and quiet handoffs, carried by men who trusted him because they were tied to him by blood or childhood memories. He liked to see the numbers. In the living room of his New Jersey house, he sometimes stacked bills on the coffee table, not just to count them, but to feel how much space they took up. People later spoke of him claiming to make $1 million a day at his peak. Investigators and historians doubt that exact figure, but no one questions that the profits were enormous for a man who had grown up with almost nothing. What set his product apart was consistency. While other dealers stretched their supply with cheap additives until it was weak, he sent out heroin that was far more concentrated. The blue stamped bags with the blue magic name came to stand for a certain level of strength. Addicted users spread the word quickly. If you wanted something that didn't feel watered down, you looked for that brand. He understood branding as well as any legitimate marketer. He kept the name steady, the quality relatively uniform, and the price slightly lower than his rivals. The effect was simple and devastating. People abandoned other suppliers, even if they had bought from them for years. In back rooms and on sidewalks, frustrated dealers muttered about the new source that was cutting into their income. That success brought him into direct competition with another rising figure in Harlem's Underworld, Leroy, Nicky Barnes. Barnes had his own ambitions and his own organization, one built more in collaboration with Italian crime families and local alliances. Where Frank preferred a quiet presence and close-knit relatives, Barnes enjoyed the spotlight. He wore bright clothes, posed for magazine covers, and built a public reputation as Mr. Untouchable. The two men moved in some of the same spaces but rarely shared anything like friendship. They operated in parallel, sometimes bumping into each other's interests, sometimes keeping a cautious distance. Each believed his own approach was smarter. Barnes trusted alliances and showmanship. Frank trusted secrecy and family. To maintain control of his territory, he could not rely only on low prices and quality product. The illegal economy does not respect gentle competition. When rivals tried to sell in areas he considered his, or when someone in his own circle skimmed from the top, he responded with force. He kept men around him whose job was to enforce his rules, people who carried weapons, who delivered threats, and who sometimes carried out violent acts. He did not stand over those scenes with a raised hand. That would have been too risky. Instead, he gave orders quietly, in coded language, from the relative comfort of his car or living room. He wanted distance between himself and the harshest parts of his business, but the reality remained. People were assaulted, frightened, and, in some cases, killed because he needed the streets to know that disobedience had a price. At the same time, he tried to shape another image of himself. In his neighborhood and among relatives, he liked to be seen as a generous man. He paid for Thanksgiving turkeys, gave envelopes at Christmas, covered tuition for some children, and helped with medical bills when someone's grandmother fell ill. Those gestures bought him goodwill. When police came asking questions, many residents stayed silent, out of loyalty, fear, or a mix of both. Inside his household, he worked to keep his criminal life and his family insulated from each other, at least in the early years. His wife, Juliana, enjoyed the fruits of his success. Fancy clothes, jewelry, trips. They moved into a spacious house in Teaneck, New Jersey, far from the crowded apartments of Harlem. On quiet mornings, their yard looked like any other family's patch of suburbia: grass, trees, a driveway, children laughing. Only the stacks of cash and the late-night calls reminded anyone that this was not a normal home. He set up front businesses to launder profits. Dry cleaners, gas stations, legitimate-looking companies that could explain money flowing through bank accounts. Some of his brothers and cousins appeared on paper as owners. He bought farmland in North Carolina, partly as an investment, partly as a way to root his success in the soil he had once picked crops from for pennies. He wanted something solid he could point to and say, "This is mine." Yet as his confidence grew, so did his pride. The quiet, low-profile approach that had helped him rise began to crack. The clearest sign of that came on one famous night in 1971 at Madison Square Garden, during the first boxing match between Joe Frazier and Muhammad Ali. Celebrities and powerful figures from every corner of American life filled the arena. The cameras swept over actors, singers, mobsters, politicians. In that glittering crowd, he took his seat in the front row, close enough to see sweat fly with every punch. Over his shoulders, he wore something that would haunt him for years. A full-length chinchilla coat with a matching hat. A gift from Juliana that cost more than many people's homes. Until that night, many in law enforcement didn't know his face. A few narcotics detectives had heard rumors of a new supplier, someone bypassing traditional lines, but they didn't have a clear picture. The coat changed that when a New Jersey detective named Richie Roberts looked across the arena and saw a man he didn't recognize sitting closer to the ring than famous gangsters, in a coat that screamed wealth. His instincts lit up. He later said that in that moment, he began to wonder who this stranger was and how he could afford that seat. The image of that coat, bright, extravagant, impossible to miss, cut against everything Frank had always told his crew about staying invisible. He soon realized the mistake. According to his own account, he burned the coat later, furious that a moment of vanity had drawn attention. But by then, someone in law enforcement had already started asking questions. While he continued running his business, a separate story unfolded in offices and unmarked cars. The new Federal Drug Enforcement Administration, created in 1973, poured energy into understanding the heroin trade in New York and New Jersey. Local detectives worked with federal agents, slowly building files. They tracked overdoses, seized packages, and listened as informants mentioned a man connected to pure heroin, someone with roots down south and ties to Southeast Asia. On chalkboards and file folders, different teams began tracing lines between small-time sellers, mid-level distributors, and larger suppliers. At first they saw only fragments: street names, car descriptions, rumors of shipments linked to military flights. Over time, the name Frank started to appear, then Lucas. Information from separate investigations into Ike Atkinson in Asia, into corrupt soldiers, into Harlem distribution began to overlap. The investigators were not saints themselves. Some officers in New York's narcotics units took bribes, stole money during raids, or shook down dealers for free drugs. This culture of corruption made it harder to build a clean case. It also made his eventual cooperation, years later, especially explosive. But in the early and mid-1970s, honest and dishonest officers alike were tangled in a war on drugs that was chaotic, poorly coordinated, and often reactive instead of strategic. While law enforcement tried to map his network, he focused on expansion and control. He pushed his product beyond Harlem into Newark, Paterson, and other New Jersey communities. He supplied smaller cities upstate and beyond. Each new territory meant more profit and more potential witnesses if anything went wrong. He traveled back to Southeast Asia at least once more, checking on supply, reinforcing connections. The war was nearing its end, and he knew that once American troops pulled out, his route would become more complicated. There were whispers that corrupt channels were closing and that some partners were growing nervous. He moved quickly to bring in as much as he could while the window remained open. Back home, the cost of his success showed in hospital wards and living rooms. Heroin use in New York and nearby states spiked during these years. Some addicted users lost jobs, homes, partners. Young people who had once hoped for college or better work found themselves trapped in daily cycles of seeking money for their next dose. Emergency rooms saw more overdoses, detox centers filled, and families held quiet funerals for loved ones who had gradually disappeared into dependency. He told himself that he was simply meeting demand. He claimed that if he hadn't brought in pure heroin, others would have flooded the streets with weaker, riskier versions. This kind of argument helped him live with the reality of what his business did, but it did nothing for the parents who sat on worn couches wondering where their children had gone. Inside his crew, trouble simmered. Relatives argued about money and status. Some felt they deserved bigger shares. Others didn't like certain enforcement tactics. A few grew reckless, spending openly in clubs, bragging about their connections. Each loose tongue was a possible leak. Each jealous glance was a seed of betrayal. He tried to keep order with a mix of rewards and fear. Loyal workers received cars, jewelry, and cash. Those who stepped out of line faced demotion, punishment, or worse. Family ties helped, but they couldn't erase human nature. Ambition and resentment were constant threats. More than once, he had to pull someone aside and remind them that one careless conversation could send them all to prison. Meanwhile, investigators like Richie Roberts followed thin trails. Roberts, working out of the Essex County Prosecutor's Office, had built a reputation for turning in a huge amount of cash found in a car trunk instead of keeping any for himself, a rare act in a time of widespread police graft. That honesty would later make him a key figure in federal efforts to bring down large traffickers. Roberts and his colleagues watched as mid-level arrests repeatedly led, indirectly, to the same quiet figure in New Jersey. They listened to intercepted calls, followed cars across bridges, documented meetings outside restaurants and motels. They watched his relatives visiting banks, depositing amounts that didn't make sense for people with no visible legitimate income. As months turned into years, a case took shape. It wasn't a single dramatic piece of evidence, but rather a painstaking accumulation of small facts. Photographs, bank records, informant statements, surveillance logs. In the background, political pressure grew. The Nixon administration had declared drugs public enemy number one. Agencies faced demands to show results. Back in Teaneck, in the big house in its manicured lawn, he believed he had outsmarted them all. He saw raids hit other dealers. He saw men he once knew disappear into the prison system. Still, no one had come to his door. To him, that looked like proof that his careful planning worked. He spent evenings with his children, took his wife to restaurants, and drove through Harlem with a kind of quiet royalty, seeing the same streets where he had once hustled for small bills. People stared, some with admiration, some with anger, some with the complicated respect that comes from fear. He felt untouchable. The truth was different. Files with his name on them sat in metal cabinets. Maps with lines drawn across them hung on office walls. A small group of determined investigators had made him their main target. They knew where he lived. They knew many of the people who worked for him. They were simply waiting for the right moment, gathering just enough evidence to make sure that when they finally knocked on his door, he wouldn't slip away on a technicality. The stage was set. A powerful trafficker at the peak of his pride, an addiction crisis gripping communities, and a team of investigators narrowing the circle around him week by week. He still believed he could shape his own fate. He didn't yet understand that the same discipline and organization that had made his empire work so well had also created a clear trail for those patient enough to follow it. Snow had not yet begun to fall, but the air in New Jersey carried that sharp, cold taste that meant winter was close. In the big house in Teaneck, the mornings looked calm. Children got ready for school. Coffee simmered in the kitchen. A radio played quietly in the background. From the outside, it could have been any family's place in the suburbs. Inside, something darker moved beneath the surface. Calls came in at odd hours, voices already strained. Runners reported unexpected police stops. Low-level sellers complained that strangers kept appearing on corners and then vanishing. Cars that no one recognized lingered a little too long at the end of certain blocks. He tried to brush it off at first. In that line of work, paranoia was almost part of the job. Rumors flew every day. This person had turned informant, that crew had been raided, some high-ranking figure had disappeared. Plenty of those whispers led nowhere. Yet as the early 1970 seconds rolled on, the feeling that something had changed no longer seemed like simple nerves. The numbers still looked good. Payments arrived, shipments moved. The brand held its strong reputation on the streets. But behind the scenes, there were signs that forces he could not see had begun to close in. Across the Hudson River, paperwork told its own story. Bank clerks filed reports about large cash deposits made by people with modest day jobs or no listed employment at all. Utility companies had addresses flagged for unusually high traffic at strange hours. Hospital staff, asked to track overdose cases more carefully, saw patterns linking certain neighborhoods and nicknames. In an office in Newark, stacks of folders grew taller on the desk of a young prosecutor named Richie Roberts. He and a small group of investigators saw clues that others overlooked or ignored. Arrest one mid-level courier in New Jersey, listen carefully during questioning, and a familiar description would surface. A quiet man from North Carolina, running things from Teaneck, with a pipeline to distant fields overseas. They couldn't see the whole picture yet, but they sensed that someone had figured out a way to bypass traditional suppliers and flood Harlem and nearby cities with strong heroin, that someone had money, discipline, and a network that stretched from Southeast Asia to the streets around 125th. Roberts had no desire to become part of the corruption that clung to some corners of law enforcement in those years. An earlier incident had defined him. He had discovered hundreds of thousands of dollars in unclaimed drug cash and turned every dollar in, instead of keeping any for himself. In a time when too many officers saw seizures as personal bonuses, that act marked him as different. Now, assigned to focus on large-scale narcotics trafficking, he narrowed his attention to the man from Teaneck. Surveillance began in earnest. Unmarked vehicles watched the house. License plates of visitors were recorded and checked. Agents followed family cars across bridges, noting meeting spots, diners, side streets where brief exchanges took place. Some of those being watched sensed the heat. A cousin complained that he was being followed by the same sedan day after day. Another relative reported that uniformed officers seemed to stop him for routine checks, far more often than made sense. The warning signs reached Frank in fragments. He adjusted where he could. Meetings shifted to new locations. Conversations moved from phones to in-person talks on busy sidewalks, where background noise helped block listening devices. Some family members were told to slow their spending and avoid obvious displays of wealth. Even then, a part of him believed that his careful structure would hold. For years, he had trusted in the tightness of his circle. Most key positions were filled by relatives from back-home brothers, cousins, in-laws. They had grown up with the same poverty, shared the same meals, remembered the same hardships. He counted on that shared history as a shield against betrayal. What he couldn't see were the pressures building on people he barely thought about. Smaller buyers facing long prison terms if they didn't talk. Corrupt officials trying to protect themselves by redirecting attention upward. Low-level operators who decided that information was their only bargaining chip. Piece by piece, details slipped into the hands of prosecutors and agents. Names, addresses, phone numbers, the location of stash apartments, the pattern of weekly collections. One informant described his route, from Harlem to a certain New Jersey town, to a particular street, to a large house with a well-kept lawn. By early 1975, the circle around him had grown tight enough for law enforcement to move. Warrants were prepared. Judges signed orders allowing searches and arrests. Teams were assembled, briefed on floor plans and possible escape routes. And one winter night, as the household in Teaneck slept, vans rolled quietly into position. Just before dawn, his wife woke to the thud of feet on the porch. Shouts exploded. Commands, names, warnings. The front door shook, then gave way under the force of a battering tool. In a rush of footsteps and flashing lights, officers poured into bedrooms and hallways, weapons drawn, voices overlapping. He came awake to the sound of his children crying and the sight of strangers in dark jackets sweeping through the house. Hands went up before anyone told him to raise them. Years in that life had taught instinctive responses. He saw agents fan out, some heading toward closets, others toward the basement. Still others straight to the living room where cash had sometimes been stacked in plain sight. Rooms were turned over with the cold efficiency of people who had done this many times before. Mattress covers were ripped, drawers dumped, ceiling panels lifted. In hidden compartments, in small safes, in places behind walls where he had once felt secure, officers found what they had come for: bundles of money, ledgers, and evidence linking the house to narcotics distribution. Later, the exact amount of cash found became a point of argument. Frank told interviewers that there had been millions. Official reports listed far less. Some money disappeared in the chaos of the raid, likely pocketed by officers who saw opportunity in the confusion. Roberts, stepping through the house shortly afterward, pushed to have whatever remained counted and logged properly, disgusted at the sight of colleagues slipping bills into their clothing. For the man in handcuffs, details about who took what that morning mattered less than one hard reality. The illusion of immunity had shattered. As he was led outside into the cold, past flashing lights and news cameras that had arrived quickly, he knew that this scene would not be easy to talk his way out of. Neighbors, curious and anxious, peered from their windows. They had seen the expensive cars, the stylish visitors, the carefully kept yard. Now they watched as federal agents guided their famous neighbor into a waiting vehicle. Some shook their heads quietly, others whispered that it had only been a matter of time. At the station, fingerprint ink stained his fingertips as he was processed like any other suspect. A camera flashed. A booking number was assigned. The charges read out sounded almost unreal in their length. Conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, operating a continuing criminal enterprise, possession of illegal weapons, tax violations, and more. Sitting in a holding cell, the weight of those words settled slowly. For years, he had built his organization with an eye toward staying just far enough from the day-to-day sales that, if anything happened, lower-level people would absorb the main impact. Now, prosecutors argued that he occupied the very center of the operation, the mind directing the flow. While he waited for arraignment, newspapers began to print his name. Articles told readers that a major figure in the heroin trade had been captured in a New Jersey home. Some called him a kingpin. Others compared him to characters from crime novels. Reporters repeated the most dramatic rumors. Direct ties to war zones, hidden fortunes, a trail of addictions stretching across states. His attorneys advised him to stay quiet. No grand statements, no interviews, no outbursts. Let the legal process run its course, they said. They hinted that evidence could be challenged, that witnesses might crumble under cross-examination, that jurors might doubt stories that sounded too large. But while defense plans formed, the other side only grew stronger. Investigators went to work on the materials seized during the raid. Phone lists were examined, numbers dialed, new suspects identified. Bank records, property deeds, and car registrations were pulled. Relatives and associates were called before grand juries, some under threat of their own charges if they refused to answer. In jail, he watched men come and go, many of them caught with small quantities of the drug he had once supplied. Some recognized him and stared with a mix of fear and curiosity. Others whispered stories about how rich he had been, how powerful. Those stories rarely mentioned the families who had been broken along the way. His wife, left to manage the household under a cloud of suspicion, faced aggressive questions and frozen bank accounts. By then, the comfortable life in Teaneck had already begun to dissolve. Cars were seized, valuables cataloged as possible proceeds of crime. Friends who had gladly accepted gifts in better times now hesitated to visit or return calls. The trial that followed did not race by. It unfolded slowly, like a long, grinding storm. Prosecutors brought in agents to describe surveillance. They presented pictures taken from afar, him at meetings, him entering certain buildings, him with known distributors. They showed jurors charts linking street sellers to middle managers, then up to a small group of relatives, and finally, to the man sitting at the defense table. Witnesses stepped forward, some wearing prison clothing, others in suits. A few spoke reluctantly, clearly afraid. They described carrying money to his house, receiving instructions, delivering packages. Defense lawyers tried to undermine their credibility, pointing out that many had accepted deals in exchange for testimony. In some cases, that argument landed. In others, the details seemed too specific to be inventions. There were no videos of him holding heroin, no recordings of him saying, This is my empire. He had been too careful for that. Still, prosecutors argued that the weight of circumstantial evidence, combined with insiders' accounts, painted a clear picture of leadership in a large-scale trafficking network. When it came time for the defense, his attorneys emphasized that key parts of his story about coffins and million-dollar daily earnings had been repeated in the press without solid documentation. They suggested that investigators were more interested in headlines than truth. They painted him as a target of a political campaign more than a fair trial. Jurors listened. They saw photographs of overdose scenes and read descriptions of families hurt by heroin. They heard about violence used to enforce territory, even if exact incidents were not mapped directly to him. They also saw pictures of the Teaneck house, the luxury items, the stacks of cash recovered. In their minds, the overall pattern was hard to ignore. When the verdict came, the courtroom air felt thick. The four-person stood and answered the judge's questions, count after count. Guilty. On conspiracy. On trafficking. On operating an ongoing criminal enterprise. Each word landed like a separate blow. The sentence, when announced, ran long enough to sound almost unreal, decades behind bars. A length of time that, on paper, stretched out beyond what most lives hold. He had once imagined old age surrounded by grandchildren in a large house. Now, the law said those years would unfold behind concrete walls and metal doors. As marshals led him away, his wife watched from the benches, tears standing in her eyes. She had seen him rise from nothing to the height of illegal wealth. Now she saw that tower collapse in a single morning. Their children, too young to grasp every legal term, understood only that their father would not be coming home for a very long time. Prison life stripped away many of the external signs of success. The tailored suits were gone, replaced by standard uniforms. Fine meals gave way to cafeteria trays. The man who had once given orders and watched entire neighborhoods respond now lined up for head counts and followed strict routines set by others. Inside, he still carried his memories. Nights in his cell stretched out, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He remembered the fields in North Carolina, the early days in Harlem, his first meetings with Bumpy Johnson, the trip to Asia, the smell of Bangkok streets at night, the front row seat at Madison Square Garden, the feel of that chinchilla coat on his shoulders. He also remembered the faces of people whose lives had gone off the rails because of the product he had supplied, even if he had never met them directly. He tried, at first, to adopt the same mindset he had used on the outside. Assess the situation, look for angles, plan years ahead. But prison was a different landscape. Power there belonged to guards, to informal hierarchies among inmates, to rules that shifted without warning. He was no longer at the top of anything. Not long after sentencing, word reached him that prosecutors wanted to talk. They believed he could help expose other suppliers, associates, and, perhaps most explosive of all, corrupt law enforcement officers who had taken bribes or stolen evidence over the years. This offer presented a choice that cut to the core of the world he had lived in. On one side stood the old code. Never cooperate, never testify, never give authorities information that could lead to someone else's downfall. On the other side stood his own future, and that of his family. A decades-long sentence meant his children might grow up without him. His wife might gray and age while he watched through glass. Prosecutors laid it out plainly. If he agreed to share what he knew, in detail, and backed his words with evidence and testimony, they would support a drastic reduction in his punishment. If he refused, he could expect to spend a large part of whatever years remained to him in that confined space. He wrestled with the decision. The men he had learned from in Harlem had always preached loyalty, at least on the surface. Yet he had also watched many of those same men turn on each other when threatened, or shift blame downward to protect themselves. The romantic idea of a strict moral code in the underworld did not always match reality. He thought about the officers who had robbed dealers during raids, sold confiscated drugs back onto the streets, and taken envelopes in exchange for ignoring certain addresses. Those men, he reasoned, had already betrayed the public trust. Exposing them might feel different from turning on a partner who had always dealt fairly. In the end, self-preservation and concern for his family overpowered any sense of allegiance to a network that had already begun to fracture. He agreed to cooperate. Over the following months and years, he gave names, dates, meeting places. He described how money had changed hands, who had protected which routes, which officials had turned a blind eye on purpose. Investigators checked his statements against their own records and informants. Some claims matched existing evidence perfectly. Others seemed inflated, part of the storytelling flair he had always enjoyed. They took what they could verify and used it to build cases. The results rippled outward. Dozens of police officers in New York and New Jersey faced charges, from simple theft to deeper involvement in narcotics. More than 100 people connected to heroin trafficking were arrested or indicted, some eventually convicted. The very system that had allowed his business to flourish through bribery, intimidation, and neglect found itself exposed and forced, at least briefly, to look in the mirror. Behind prison walls, he watched news clippings and heard updates from his lawyers. His cooperation did not win him admiration among other inmates, but it did shift his legal situation. Years disappeared from his sentence on paper. The possibility of walking on a sidewalk as a free man again no longer felt like pure fantasy. By the early 1980 seconds, the man who had once seemed destined to spend most of his life in a cell was told that he would be paroled. The same system that had condemned him to decades had, through his own choices, opened a door much sooner than anyone expected. He stepped out into a world that had changed since the day federal agents crashed through his front door. The streets were different, the players in the underworld had shifted, and public conversations about drugs had moved on to new crises. He had time left, but no clear path. All the skills that had once made him rich were now useless if he wanted to stay free. The question that waited for him, quiet but constant, was simple and hard at the same time. After everything he had done, and everything that had happened to him in return, what kind of man would he try to be on the outside? When the prison gates opened and he stepped outside, the air felt both familiar and wrong. Sunlight hit his face the way it had when he was a boy in North Carolina. But now, it carried years of memory with it. He had left the world as a man people whispered about. He returned with a number attached to his name and a file that said he had betrayed old allies to save himself. Freedom didn't come with instructions. No one handed him a guide on how to be an ordinary man after living as a symbol of excess and then as an informer. The first nights on the outside, he slept badly. The silence of a small apartment was different from the constant clatter of the cell block. Sometimes he woke in the dark, thinking he heard guards calling for count. America in the early 1980 seconds was not the same country he had left in the mid-70 seconds. The clothes were different. The cars looked sharper. The music on street corners had changed. A new drug, crack cocaine, was beginning to carve its own violent path through cities. Heroin was still present, but it no longer sat alone at the center of the national panic. His old network was gone. Some of the men he had worked with were in prison. Others had drifted into smaller schemes. A few had vanished, changing states or names. The landscape that had once bent around him now moved without him, driven by younger operators who knew his legend more than his face. He tried, at least on the surface, to live differently. Parole conditions left little room for risk. Regular check-ins, restrictions on travel, warnings that any slip would send him back. He spent time with family, especially his children, who had grown while he was away. Faces that had been small and round were now older, carrying their own frustrations and questions. Money, which had once flowed through his hands in stacks, now came in thin streams. The fortune he had built had been stripped by seizures, legal bills, greedy officers, and years of neglect. Front businesses had withered without him. Properties were gone or tangled in court orders. He went from signing off on large purchases to counting smaller bills again. He talked, now and then, about going straight in a real way. Opening a legitimate business, maybe a small store or a car service. Something that would keep food on the table without drawing attention. But his name made normal dealings complicated. Some people welcomed the chance to shake his hand. Others turned away, not wanting their own lives tied to someone whose past could scare banks and landlords. The choices he had once made so easily where to invest, who to trust now felt heavier. Pride still lived inside him, accepting ordinary work, the kind that paid slowly and demanded constant effort, felt like swallowing medicine with a bitter taste. He carried the memory of what he had once controlled. Rows of cars, a big house, the feeling of walking into a room and knowing everyone watched him. Temptation didn't arrive as a single dramatic offer. It came in small conversations. An old associate, running a minor operation, dropped hints. There was still money to be made. A cousin mentioned someone looking for a connection. Another friend complained about bills and muttered that there were easier ways to pay them if a certain person was willing to make a few calls. For a while, he pushed those suggestions aside. He had seen too many concrete walls and locked doors to rush back into danger. But the pull of his old world never really left. Years in that trade had trained him to see shortcuts everywhere. Each day spent watching other people struggle through ordinary jobs, each envelope with just enough inside to pay rent and not much more. Scratched at his ego. He also had a complicated relationship with his own reputation. Journalists had written about his case, neighbors whispered. Some younger men, who had been children during his peak years, now approached him with a strange mix of respect and curiosity, asking about the old days, as if they were talking to a retired athlete. Those conversations fed the part of him that still enjoyed feeling larger than life, even if the empire was long gone. The decision to step back over the line didn't announce itself. It unfolded as a gradual slide. A small introduction here. A favor there. Agreeing to make a call that connected one person to another. Accepting a little cash for advice on how to avoid detection. Each act felt minor enough to excuse in the moment. Then, in 1984, came the move that pulled him fully back into the storm. Investigators later described it as a simple undercover operation. Officers posing as buyers, a meeting arranged, drugs brought to the table. According to law enforcement records, he showed up with a quantity of heroin and some cocaine, prepared to trade them for money. The numbers were tiny compared to what he had once handled, but the legal consequences didn't care about scale. The arrest went nothing like the dramatic raid in Teaneck years before. There was no large house, no television cameras pointed at a suburban driveway. This time, he was taken quietly, set against the backdrop of an America now bracing for a new drug crisis. To the officers making the collar, he was not a mysterious giant. He was a repeat offender who had learned nothing. When he heard the new charges, a kind of tired disbelief settled over him. All the time he had spent in prison, all the deals he had cut to shorten that first sentence, all the names he had given, none of it had been enough to keep him from following the same path. The man who had once sworn, sitting on his bunk, that he would never again give the system a reason to lock him up, had done exactly that. This time, prosecutors didn't need years of investigation. The case was straightforward. An attempted sale to undercover officers. No overseas plots. No long chains of middlemen. He pled guilty. The judge, reading his record, did not see a man deserving of another deep discount. A new sentence followed years more behind bars, wiping out the brief taste of freedom he had just begun to get used to. Back in prison, older now, he felt the difference in his body. The routines were the same counts, lines, metal doors, but his energy was not. He had traded valuable information after his first conviction. This time, he had far less to offer. Many of the people he had known in the trade were already in prison, retired, or dead. The law had less use for him. He had long hours to think about why, after surviving so much, he had gone back. Pride answered first, insisting that a man like him wasn't meant to live on scraps. But another, quieter voice admitted that he had never truly learned how to build a life without shortcuts. Crime had become his only comfortable skill. Without it, he had felt like a man standing in a foreign country, without knowing the language. His relationship with his family strained further. His wife, already worn from years of courtrooms and sudden changes, faced another stretch of visiting rooms and long-distance conversations. His children, now old enough to understand more, carried the weight of a last name tied to police files and newspaper clippings. They had heard their father's justifications over the years, his stories about racism and poverty and the unfair structure of society. Now they had to live with the simple fact that he had broken the law again when he had another chance to walk away. During this second sentence, he began to age in visible ways. Gray hair spread. Stiffness set into his joints. At one point, a car accident during a temporary release would later leave him relying on a wheelchair, his mobility permanently reduced. The man who had once moved through Harlem in expensive shoes now had to think carefully about each small transfer from bed to chair. While he sat in his cell, the outside world continued to rewrite his story without asking him. Articles about the drug wars of the 1,970 seconds mentioned his name as a key figure, sometimes sliding past the cooperation that had helped him reduce his sentence. His legend grew in some circles, fed by half-true tales of millions in hidden money, military coffins packed with contraband, and deals struck with mysterious suppliers overseas. People who had stood beside him during those years told different versions. Leslie Ike Atkinson, his relative and one-time partner in Southeast Asia, would later argue that many of the wildest stories were exaggerated. He insisted that the coffin scheme had been overstated, that other smuggling methods had been more important, that the $1 million a day claim belonged more to imagination than record books. Journalists and authors dug into files, comparing court documents with interviews, and found a web of truth, boast, and carefully shaped narrative. Still, even critics agreed on the essentials. He had built a large heroin operation, he had moved product from Asia to America, he had enriched himself while addiction tore through his community, and he had eventually testified against dozens of others, including corrupt police, to secure reduced time. When he was finally paroled again in the early 1992, he left prison not as a feared kingpin or a fresh-faced ex-protege, but as an aging man with heavy history and limited options. The drug trade he had once dominated had evolved without him. Crack had reshaped inner-city markets. New suppliers controlled routes he no longer understood. Young men on corners knew his name the way people know figures from old stories, not as a current force. This time, the window for another return to organized crime was smaller. His health was weaker, law enforcement more coordinated, the risk-to-reward ratio worse. He had already paid with years of his life. Another round could easily mean spending the rest of his days behind bars. Stripped of illusions about a triumphant comeback, he found himself pushed toward a different role, that of a cautionary symbol. Community groups, churches, and some schools were willing to let him speak to young people, as long as he framed his past as a warning, not a blueprint. He talked about prison food, about seeing men lose decades to concrete, about watching families drift away during long bids. In front of those audiences, he sometimes still slipped into old habits of storytelling, highlighting daring moves or clever tactics. Interviewers and organizers had to nudge him back toward the darker consequences. When pressed, he did not deny the harm he had caused. He spoke about seeing people nodding off on stoops, about mothers begging dealers to stop selling to their sons, about attending funerals for people who had once been full of energy. His cooperation with authorities years earlier also opened an odd path. He developed a professional connection, and eventually a kind of friendship, with Richie Roberts, the same prosecutor who had once led efforts to put him behind bars. Roberts later served as his lawyer in some matters, helping him navigate legal and financial problems after release. The image of a former dealer and the man who had pursued him sitting across from each other not as enemies but as client and attorney fascinated reporters. They asked both men how such a shift was possible. Each gave variations of the same answer. Time changes people, and the law, for all its harshness, sometimes forges strange bonds among those who move through its machinery. As the years moved on, a new project brought his story back into wider public view. Hollywood producers, drawn by the mix of crime, corruption, and personal transformation, developed a film built loosely around his life and the investigation that brought him down. He consulted, told his favorite stories, watched actors portray versions of real people he had known. When the movie finally came out, audiences worldwide saw a dramatized account of his rise and fall on big screens. The film captured certain truths: the arrogance of his peak years, the damage of the heroin trade, the deep corruption inside some parts of law enforcement, the legal bargain that turned a feared trafficker into a witness. It also stretched or altered details for drama, condensing timelines, sharpening conflicts, simplifying complex relationships. Viewers left theaters believing in coffin schemes that may have been more rare than the script suggested, and in a direct mentorship with Bumpy Johnson that historians argue was shorter and less central than the movie implies. He saw the film, sitting in a dark theater, as strangers reacted to scenes drawn from his life. Some gasped at the violence, others shook their heads at the waste of talent, a few seemed caught up in the glamour woven onto the screen. For him, it was both recognition and distortion. He had wanted the world to know his name. Now they did, but through a lens he did not fully control. In interviews after the movie's release, he leaned into certain parts of the legend, repeating stories that made him sound bigger, sharper, more central than documents fully support. At the same time, he began to emphasize the cost more clearly. The lost years, the broken families, the communities still struggling with the echoes of addiction. By then, the physical signs of age were impossible to ignore. He spent much of his time in a wheelchair, the accident and years of hard living catching up to him. The man who had once measured success in cars and cash now measured good days by whether pain stayed manageable and whether he could spend time with children and grandchildren without interruption. He never became rich again. Whatever money he made from consulting, speaking, or advising on film projects did not approach the fortunes of his peak criminal years. That gap underlined a simple reality. Crime had given him more wealth than the straight world ever would, but at a cost that could not be refunded. Every dollar earned legally now came slowly, with paperwork attached and taxes due. Sitting by windows in modest homes, in New Jersey and later in Newark, he watched younger generations walk past. Some wore the same look in their eyes he had once carried, a hard mix of hunger and impatience. When they approached him, asking how he had done it, he sometimes responded sharply, telling them how many of his friends were dead, how many were still locked away, how many children of that era had grown up visiting prisons instead of parks. Other times the old pride slipped out, and he described the scale of his former operation with a hint of satisfaction. His life remained full of contradictions until the end. A man who had exposed police corruption but also poisoned neighborhoods, who built wealth in a racist system that tried to keep him poor but used methods that tore apart the very communities he said he wanted to lift. As old age settled in, he had more time than most men to sit with those opposites. The boy from La Grange who swore he would never be powerless again, the young runner in Harlem learning from older hands, the smuggler crossing oceans, the father in a mansion watching his children play on a suburban lawn, the prisoner staring at a gray wall, the informant naming names, the speaker warning teenagers not to follow him. These were all the same person, carrying the weight of each version wherever he went. By the time his story reached movie screens, he was already an old man using a wheelchair more than his own legs. Years in custody, a serious car wreck, and the ordinary wear of age had left his body fragile, even while his mind stayed sharp enough to remember details from decades before. On the day the big film about his life opened, he wasn't in a mansion or a luxury box. He was living quietly in Newark, in a modest place far removed from the house in Teaneck that agents had once stormed. A few reporters came by, cameras in hand, wanting to capture his reaction. Neighbors looked on, trying to connect the man they saw rolling down the sidewalk with the intense face on the movie posters. He watched the film not at a premiere surrounded by stars, but in an ordinary theater, sitting among regular people who had paid for their tickets with afterwork money. As the lights dimmed and the opening scenes rolled, he saw a younger version of himself on the screen in the form of a famous actor. Harlem glowed with that strange mix of glamour and grit that only cinema can create. Scenes flashed by that stirred his memory. Crowded corners, sharp suits, tense meetings. He saw an actor playing Bumpy Johnson, guiding a young country boy through a hidden economy. He saw a version of Richie Roberts, working late in an office, chasing a faceless enemy. He saw Southeast Asian villages, soldiers, coffins lifted off planes. And at the center of it all, a character with his name, making deals, counting money, issuing orders. As the audience reacted, gasps at the violence, low murmurs during tense moments, laughter at bits of dark humor, he sat mostly still. Some scenes made him nod. Others drew a small frown. Certain events were pushed together for drama. Relationships were simplified. The coffin shipments were shown on screen in a way that made them look like the main artery of his business, even though real smugglers and investigators later insisted that wooden crates and military cargo lines had probably carried more product than caskets ever did. When the lights came up at the end and people began to file out, conversations floated above the seats. "He was smart," someone said. "He ruined a lot of lives," another replied. "That cop was the real hero," someone else muttered. He rolled toward the exit, hearing all of it at once, like an echo of every argument about him that had ever happened. Genius or villain, strategist or parasite, product of racism or architect of misery. The film had not settled those questions. It had just thrown them onto a larger screen. In the weeks that followed, interview requests poured in. Television shows, magazines, and radio stations wanted a piece of the real man behind the movie. He sat in studios under bright lights, a microphone clipped to his shirt, answering the same questions again and again. Did you really ship heroin in soldiers' coffins? Did you actually make $1 million a day? How much of the movie was true? Sometimes he leaned into the legend, repeating the coffin tale as if it were the full story, letting numbers roll off his tongue that sounded almost mythical. Other times, especially when older journalists or former agents pushed him, he admitted that figures had been stretched, that a good story traveled farther than a plain one. There was one person who knew the case from the other side and was willing to talk publicly: Richie Roberts. The former prosecutor, now a defense lawyer, appeared in some of those interviews sitting beside the man he had once chased. They agreed on certain facts: that a major operation had existed, that Lucas had cooperated deeply after his arrest, that dozens of officers and traffickers went down because of what he revealed. They disagreed on others. Roberts doubted the million-a-day claim, calling it an exaggeration. He questioned some of the film's scenes but defended its basic arc. Their odd partnership fascinated people. In the past, the line between them had been clear: law on one side, crime on the other. Time had blurred that divide. Now Roberts helped Lucas sort out old legal problems, and Lucas admitted that without that help, he might have drifted into trouble again even after his final release. Not everyone accepted the movie version of events or Lucas's retelling without protest. Leslie Ike Atkinson, the man who had been key to building the pipeline from Southeast Asia, took issue with being painted as a side character. In interviews of his own, he argued that he, not Frank, had been the true architect of much of the smuggling. He dismissed some of the coffin drama as overblown and said his cousin Unyalaw had taken credit for things that involved many hands. Former New York narcotics detectives bristled at how the film showed law enforcement as almost entirely rotten, except for one heroic prosecutor. Some admitted that corruption had been real, that cash and drugs had gone missing from evidence rooms, that officers had shaken down dealers. Still, they insisted that many agents had risked their lives chasing traffickers honestly, including Lucas. These debates swirled mostly in media circles, and among people who had lived through that era directly. On the streets, among younger listeners who discovered his story through the film, nuance often faded. He became a symbol either of clever defiance or of destructive greed, depending on who was talking. He found himself invited to speak in places he never would have imagined as a young man: law schools, community centers, anti-drug events. Standing or sitting, more often, in his chair before rooms full of students and organizers, he talked about how easy it had been to believe he was simply outsmarting a biased system, and how hard it had been later to face the reality of what heroin had done to the neighborhoods that had once cheered his generosity. He described small scenes that never made it into any screenplay. Parents asleep on subway benches with used bags still in their pockets, kids waiting outside liquor stores for adults who never came back out, relatives arguing in whispered tones in cramped kitchens about whether to cut off a loved one who kept stealing from them to buy drugs. He admitted that during his prime, he had tried not to look too closely at those realities. Money, distance, and the day-to-day demands of running an illegal enterprise had made it easy to keep his gaze on numbers, not faces. At some events, former users or their family members confronted him directly. "Because of people like you," one woman said softly in a church basement after a talk, "I lost my brother." He did not argue with her. There was no neat answer. He couldn't point to a chart or a government policy and push blame upward, even though he still believed that poverty, racism, and poor public services had helped create conditions for the drug trade to flourish. In those moments, explanations felt hollow. He could only say that he was sorry, that nothing he did later could truly balance the scales. His personal life remained tangled. His wife, Juliana, had stood beside him through his first rise and fall, serving her own time in prison for drug-related charges. Even after he claimed to be finished with crime forever, she struggled to leave that world entirely. In 2010, years after his final release, she was arrested once more, accused of arranging a cocaine deal in Puerto Rico. For all the talk of lessons learned, temptation still reached into their family. His children carried their father's name into a world that both glamorized and condemned it. Some tried to build ordinary lives, working steady jobs, raising their own kids far from the corners where he had once ruled. Others dabbled in entertainment or reality television, drawn by the interests that still surrounded their family history. They wrestled with a strange inheritance. Doors opened by curiosity about him, and other doors closed by fear of association. In quiet moments at home, He sometimes watched documentaries about the period when his empire had been active. He heard historians describe the 1,970 seconds heroin crisis, the burned-out outbuildings, the rising crime, the waves of incarceration that followed. He saw black and white footage of Harlem, South Bronx blocks, and Newark streets that looked like war zones, with kids playing outside gutted houses. He knew his operation had been only one slice of a much larger picture. Other suppliers, other routes, other cities all played their roles. Yet he couldn't deny that his choices had poured fuel on a fire already burning. It wasn't just anonymous users who suffered. It was neighbors, distant cousins, and friends of friends, all caught in a chain he had helped forge. He also watched how the official response to drugs had unfolded after his time at the top. Mandatory minimum sentences grew harsher. Entire generations of young men, many from the same kinds of backgrounds he had known as a child, ended up locked away for long stretches, sometimes for possessing or selling far less than he once moved. He understood the anger of critics who argued that the justice system had come down hardest on the lowest rungs, while men like him, higher up and better connected, sometimes found ways to cut deals. On some days, he blamed policymakers more than himself, arguing in interviews that if there had been decent schools, good jobs, fair treatment from banks and employers, he might never have stepped into crime. On other days, especially when he looked at his grandchildren and thought about what he wanted for them, he took more direct responsibility. "I had a choice," he admitted more than once late in life. "I could have pushed carts, done small things, lived a regular poor life. I chose that other way. Nobody put a gun to my head to make me do it." Those contradictions never fully resolved. People who met him in his 70s and 80s often came away with mixed impressions. Some felt they had met a man genuinely changed by age and regret, someone eager to steer others away from his path. Others sensed that he still took a certain satisfaction in having once beaten the odds, that a part of him still admired the younger version of himself who had walked into Southeast Asia and set up a pipeline that stunned law enforcement. He spent many afternoons by windows, watching traffic and pedestrians. In Harlem, gentrification transformed blocks he had once used as meeting points. Old storefronts gave way to cafes and chain stores. Brownstones that had sagged under neglect now shone with fresh paint and carefully restored details. The sound of jazz from smoky clubs was replaced by different kinds of music from headphones and car speakers. In Newark, where he spent much of his later life, empty lots and stubborn poverty sat side by side with new construction and slow attempts at renewal. He rolled down sidewalks where small groups still gathered on corners, though the substances and slang sometimes differed from those of his day. When a few of those young men recognized him and tried to ask for advice on how to get big, he told them something simple. "You go that way. You don't get big. You get buried, or you get boxed in." His health slipped gradually. Diabetes, the old accident, and the ordinary wear of years took their toll. Hospital visits became more frequent. Even walking a few steps without the chair left him winded. Yet people still called, still wanted his take on newer headlines about cartels, opioid epidemics, and changing drug laws. He answered when he could, though he sometimes shook his head that a life built on so many bad choices had turned him into a kind of reluctant commentator. He never found religion in a dramatic, headline-worthy way, but he did attend church services more often, especially in his final decades. He listened to sermons about forgiveness, accountability, and second chances. The idea that a life could be more than its worst acts appealed to him, even as he struggled with the knowledge that redemption for him could only ever be partial, never full. In conversations with close friends, he sometimes wondered aloud what might have happened had Bumpy Johnson never noticed him, had he never left North Carolina, had he found a union job that paid enough to support a family without hustles on the side. Those speculations didn't change the past, but they showed how far he had moved from the certainty of his youth, when every decision had seemed obvious. One thing he remained sure of was this: the line between legitimate and illegitimate power had never been as clean as people liked to think. He had watched bankers, politicians, and business leaders move money in ways that hurt poor communities as deeply as any dealer. That belief colored his view of the world until the end, even as he wrestled with how much harm he personally had added to the pile. Old friends died one by one. Men he had worked beside in the early Harlem days passed away in hospitals or nursing homes, their stories fading with them. Others died inside, never seeing the outside of a prison again. Funerals became more frequent than weddings, Each loss reminded him that, no matter how large his past had loomed once, time was shrinking his circle. All the while, clips from the film based on his life continued to play on television, turning up on late-night channels, streaming services, classroom discussions. Young people who were children when the movie first released now watched it as a period piece, a window into a version of New York and America they had never known. Some of them, curious, tracked down interviews with the real man and were surprised to see an elderly figure with careful, sometimes halting speech instead of the smooth force they had seen on screen. He reached his 80s carrying the weight of all those conflicting images: the hungry boy, the ambitious young hustler, the calculating trafficker, the prisoner, the cooperator, the aging storyteller. Each identity had left marks that couldn't be erased. How those marks would be arranged into a final judgment of his life wasn't something he could control, no matter how many times he sat before a camera to tell his side. What he could do, in those final years, was answer honestly when younger relatives asked him whether it had been worth it, whether the cars, the suits, the attention, the power had justified the nights on bunks listening to bars slam, the family's hurt, the constant fear of a knock on the door. His answers then sounded different from the confident voice that had once spoken to journalists soon after his release. Age and regret had sharpened his sense that any short-term victory built on that kind of harm eventually turns to dust, leaving only consequences behind. In those last years, the days moved slower. He woke up to pill bottles on the nightstand instead of stacks of cash. Nurses and home aides came and went, adjusting blankets, checking blood sugar, reminding him to drink water. The sounds around him were quieter now. No more engines idling outside all night. No more constant ringing of phones carrying news from the street. His wheelchair waited beside his bed each morning. The car accident years before had done damage that never really healed. And age had finished what the crash started. Knees that had once climbed staircases two at a time now refused even simple movements without protest. He had to plan every small trip, from bed to chair, from chair to kitchen table, from table back again. Yet his mind stayed sharp. He remembered names and faces from half a century earlier with startling clarity. Sitting by the window, he could close his eyes and be back in a smoky Harlem bar, could see the way Bumpy Johnson's hat cast a shadow, could hear the low murmur of men counting money, could feel the heat of Bangkok alleyways, and smell the oil and dust of military airfields. Younger people still sought him out. Some were writers or filmmakers, curious about details the movie hadn't shown. Others were academics, building histories of the drug wars that had reshaped American cities. They came with notebooks and recorders, polite questions and studied expressions. He watched them set up, noticed the way they measured their words, aware that they were digging for more than just colorful stories. He gave them what he chose. Sometimes he leaned into drama, painting meetings as more daring than they had been, turning ordinary trips into neuroscapes. Other times, especially when fatigue hung on him, he brushed off certain questions with short answers. "That part's been told enough," he would say. "Talk to me about now." Now, to him, meant grandchildren doing homework at the table, neighbors working double shifts to keep up with rent, a whole neighborhoods trying to recover from waves of addiction that had started long before crack and continued through newer substances. He watched news reports about prescription painkillers, overdoses in rural towns, debates about pharmaceutical companies. The faces were different from the Harlem crowd he had known, but the quiet devastation looked familiar. Every so often, a rapper or producer would mention his name in a song or reference blue magic as shorthand for something pure and powerful. He heard those tracks and felt a complicated knot twist inside him. Part of him still enjoyed being remembered, being stamped into culture. Another part winced at how easily the hardest years of so many lives could be turned into stylish metaphors. When journalists asked him about that mix of fear and admiration around his name, he tried to steer the conversation back to the reality behind the romance. "They see the money," he would say. "They never see the hospital beds, the courtrooms, the mamas crying. That's the real story." He knew his own story was messy. On some days, he spoke like a man searching honestly for forgiveness. On others, he sounded more like someone defending his record, pointing to racism and lack of opportunity as if those alone could explain everything. He returned often, in conversation, to his childhood, those lean years in North Carolina, when a piece of bread felt like a prize, and the rules of the South reminded him daily what his skin color meant to the people in charge. He talked about how that early humiliation and anger had pushed him toward a mindset where getting ahead by any means necessary felt not just acceptable but overdue. What he couldn't ignore anymore was that his own rise hadn't lifted his community with him. Yes, he had handed out turkeys and rent money back then. He had helped a few people here and there with hospital bills and funeral costs. But the drug he sold had drained far more wealth, stability, and health out of those blocks than any of his small acts of generosity had ever restored. When old associates visited, the conversations were softer than in their youth. Some came using canes, others with oxygen tanks, their once strong voices worn thin. They reminisced about old apartments, corner cafes long gone, nights at clubs that had been bulldozed years ago. For a little while, their words lifted them back into their 20s and 30s, when it had seemed like the streets would always respond when they called. Then the spell would break. One would mention a friend who'd died in prison. Another would talk about a son doing time, or a nephew lost to an overdose. The tally of cost echoed between them. Lives shortened, families jagged with absence. They didn't argue about guilt anymore. There wasn't enough energy left for that. They just sat with what they had done and what they hadn't undone. He kept in touch with Richie Roberts off and on. Their conversations blended legal matters with reflections on the strange shape of their shared past. The man who had once arranged surveillance on his house now helped him sort out unpaid bills, letters from agencies, late fees that piled up faster than he could track. They spoke, too, about how the system had changed and how it hadn't. Roberts pointed out reforms in evidence handling, new oversight structures, attempts to cut down on the kind of corruption that had once allowed cash and heroin to vanish from precinct safes. At the same time, both men knew that scandals in police work still surfaced, just with different names and different headlines. Sometimes they talked about the young officers coming up now, many of them, black or Latino, drawn to the badge for reasons very different from the men who had patrolled Harlem in the 1,960 seconds. He wondered aloud whether his own path would have looked different if, as a young man, he had seen law inside the precinct treat people on 116th Street with something closer to fairness. In community centers, when his health allowed, he continued to speak. The crowds changed over the years. At first, it was mostly older people who remembered his case firsthand, who had lived through the same era. Later, more and more of the faces were teenagers who knew him only as a movie character or a name in a song. He tried to keep his message simple. Every choice you make in search of quick money stacks more risks on your back, and the bill almost always comes due. He told them how fast freedom disappears, how you can go from sitting in your own kitchen drinking coffee to sitting on a metal bench in a holding cell in a matter of hours, with one bad moment. He spoke about what those long years had really felt like. Waking up to the same walls every day, watching holidays pass with nothing changing, hearing about deaths secondhand through a letter or a guard, knowing you couldn't attend funerals or hug your own children when they needed you. He explained that the worst part wasn't always the violence or the noise. Sometimes it was the monotony, the way time turned into something heavy and dull. Not everyone in those rooms believed him. A few saw only an old man whose era had passed, whose warning sounded like fear. But others listened closely. Some stayed after, lining up to talk. They told him about brothers or cousins already locked up, about fathers they saw only on visiting days, about neighborhoods where the same dance of easy money and hard consequences still played out, just with different faces. His own family tried to shape something steady out of the fragments left by his choices. One son, Francois, stepped into business and television, appearing on a reality show about urban families wrestling with legacies of crime and ambition. In those episodes, the weight of the Lucas name hung over every conversation, sometimes as opportunity, sometimes as burden. Father and son argued on camera and off, about the past, about responsibility, about what it meant to move forward without lying about where they had come from. In private, he tried to be more simply granddad than legendary dealer. He listened to school stories, celebrated graduations, smiled at birthday cakes. He offered advice that had nothing to do with crime, about saving money, treating people fairly, looking after one another. He knew he couldn't erase the past, but he could at least refuse to encourage the next generation to repeat it. As the decade turned and he crept further into his 80s, hospital stays grew longer and more frequent. Doctors talked quietly with family members in corridors. Conditions had names now: complications from diabetes, heart strain, the slow weakening that comes with age, but to him, they all felt like the body's long-delayed response to years of stress, bad food, and harder living. On some days he was talkative, still ready with a joke or a story. On others, he drifted in and out of sleep, the line between memories and the present blurring at the edges. Nurses heard fragments spill out, references to flights, to back rooms in Harlem bars, to names they didn't recognize. They knew only that this frail man had once been someone newspapers called a kingpin. He outlived many who had chased him, and many who had worked for him. Bumpy Johnson had been gone for decades. Nicky Barnes, his one-time rival, died not long before him. Detectives from the old narcotics squads passed away one by one. Their files sat in archives, their memories buried in boxes and hard drives. The world outside his window quickened in ways that would have been hard to imagine when he first stepped off the train from North Carolina. Phones shrank and grew powerful enough to hold entire libraries. Cameras appeared on every corner and in every pocket. Social media turned private lives into public shows. The kind of large-scale operation he had once run would have been much harder to hide in this new landscape, with surveillance woven into everyday life. He knew that if he had been born 50 years later, the odds of pulling off what he once did for as long as he did would have been slimmer. That recognition didn't comfort him. It just underscored how much his path had been shaped by a very particular combination of time, place, and weakness in the system. In quiet talks with pastors and old friends, he circled the same questions. How much of a man's life is his own doing? And how much is done to him by a world he didn't build? Where does hardship end and personal choice begin? He never found perfect answers. He did come to believe, more firmly, that acknowledging damage mattered more than any defense he could mount. He spoke less about clever schemes and more about apologies, not only to the families of those who had overdosed or fallen into addiction, but to his own children for the years he had missed and the burdens his name had laid on them. Some accepted those apologies readily. Others needed distance, coming around only slowly, if at all. As his strength faded, calls and visits from journalists became less frequent. The flood that had surrounded the film's release narrowed to a trickle. New crises occupied the public's attention. New scandals, new names, new debates about crime and punishment. The country rarely lingers long on any one story, no matter how dramatic it once seemed. In his final stretch, what remained were mostly the small, ordinary pieces of life he had once raced past. The taste of simple food, the feel of fresh air on a good day, the sound of a grandchild laughing in the next room, the comfort of a familiar voice reading to him from a newspaper or a Bible passage he had heard many times before. He died in 2019, in New Jersey, at 88 years old. The cause was listed in simple medical terms, without drama. No shootout, no spectacular end, just an old man whose body finally quit after years of work and wear. News of his death spread quickly online. Some outlets ran brief notices. Others offered longer reflections. Headlines called him a notorious drug kingpin, a former Harlem heroin boss, a crime figure turned informant. A few emphasized his later efforts to steer youth away from his path. Comment sections filled with arguments, condemnations, defenses, jokes, and serious debates. In Harlem and Newark, in neighborhoods that had lived through the years when his product had been most present, older residents shook their heads. To them, he was not just a character from a movie or a line in a rap verse. He was part of a memory that included abandoned buildings, broken families, and police tape across too many doorways. His funeral did not draw the kind of showy crowd that might have gathered in the 1,970 seconds. Some relatives came, some old friends who could still travel, a few people from the communities where he had once spoken. There were no television cameras parked in long lines outside, no overt displays of wealth. A man who had once made the front page for the height of his criminal career now passed quietly, his coffin carried without fanfare. Those who eulogized him spoke carefully. They mentioned his charm, his intelligence, his ability to read people. They mentioned, too, his cooperation with authorities that had helped reveal deep corruption in local law enforcement. But they did not pretend his legacy was simple. Pastors and relatives alike acknowledged that his life stood as both a warning and a complicated testament to what happens when desperation, ambition, and a broken system collide. His story did not end with that burial. It continued in the way people told it afterward. Some saw him as a symbol of how racism, poverty, and limited opportunity could twist a sharp mind into dangerous work. Others focused on personal responsibility, insisting that whatever the obstacles, he had chosen to harm his own community and could not be softened into a folk hero. For those who studied the history of drugs and policing in America, his life became a case study, one man's arc through eras of policy failure, corruption, and partial reform. For young people hearing his name for the first time, he was either a distant villain or a cautionary tale that might, if told honestly, make them think twice about chasing quick fortunes. In the end, everything he had built illegally was gone. The cars, the houses, the stacks of bills had scattered long before he took his last breath. What remained were stories. Some polished, some raw, all tangled. How each listener chose to arrange those stories said as much about their beliefs as it did about the man himself. Years after his funeral, long after the flowers on his grave had withered and been replaced a few times, his name still moved through conversations in quiet ways. Sometimes it came up in a barber chair in Harlem, when older men swapped stories about back then. Sometimes it surfaced in a classroom, when a teacher tried to explain the 1,970 seconds drug crisis and needed a concrete example. Sometimes it appeared in a line of a song, tossed off casually but carrying the weight of real history underneath. Different people remembered a different man. An older woman in Harlem, hair wrapped in a bright scarf, thought first of the envelopes of cash he had handed out on holidays, the toy drives, the groceries dropped off for families that were struggling. She could still picture him stepping out of a car, dressed neat but not too loud, smiling like a neighbor instead of a distant boss. To her, he was complicated. The man who helped her pay for her sister's funeral also helped flood the neighborhood with the substance that had destroyed that same sister's life. A retired officer, living quietly in the suburbs, felt something very different when he heard the name. He remembered narcotics briefings, mug shots on bulletin boards, endless nights of surveillance. He remembered colleagues who had accepted bribes or stolen from evidence and later found themselves indicted, in part because of what this same trafficker had told federal agents. He saw both a target they had chased and a witness who had pulled back the curtain on their own broken house. Somewhere in a recovery center, a man in his 60s attended group meetings and talked about how he had first used heroin as a teenager in the early 1,970 seconds. He described blue-stamped bags that everyone on the block said were the strongest stuff. He didn't care then whose network stood behind them. Years later, when he got clean and read about the supply chains that had fed his habit, he saw the name Frank Lucas and felt a chill. The decisions made in distant countries and quiet New Jersey living rooms had landed directly in his veins. And then there were his grandchildren, moving through a world that knew his story mainly through a glossy film and a handful of interviews online. To kids who had grown up seeing movie posters and hearing adults argue about American Gangster, he was half relative, half ghost. Some tried to separate their own identity from his shadow. Others felt a prick of pride when classmates recognized the last name, even if they weren't sure how to feel about the reasons. History, when it tried to make sense of him, split itself into piles. What could be documented? What rested on his word and that of others? And what was pure myth? On paper, certain facts stood firm. There were court records showing that he had been convicted as the leader of a large heroin operation based around Harlem and New Jersey. There were transcripts of his testimony against dozens of accomplices and corrupt officers. There were bank records, property deeds, and seized cash that traced the outlines of an organization that had reached from Southeast Asia into American cities. There were also gaps and arguments. Some of his most dramatic claims the exact scale of his profits, the amount of product moved in coffins versus standard cargo. The degree of his personal control over the entire pipeline remained harder to pin down. Other traffickers, like Ike Atkinson, gave their own accounts, insisting that the spotlight had oversimplified a network that had involved many more hands. But even when numbers were debated, the shape of the story stayed the same. A boy raised poor in the Jim Crow South had arrived in New York with little more than determination. He had attached himself to a mentor in Harlem's Underworld, learned how illegal money flowed, then found a way to cut through the established order by going directly to overseas producers of heroin. For several years, his network had controlled a major share of the high-grade supply moving into and through Harlem and beyond. Then the spotlight found him, the law closed in, and he flipped from top trafficker to government witness, helping unravel both his own enterprise and parts of the law enforcement system that had let it grow. The larger forces around his life told their own story. The war in Southeast Asia had created an environment ripe for smuggling, far-flung bases, constant flights, and local economies warped by foreign money. Weak oversight and corruption among officials there, and in the United States, opened cracks that people like him stepped through. When the war ended and those roots tightened, the landscape of the drug trade shifted again. Back in America, the same era saw factories close, unions weaken, and city budgets strain. In neighborhoods like Harlem, jobs vanished faster than they were replaced. Schools struggled, housing crumbled, and trust in government eroded. Under those conditions, illegal markets, numbers games, unlicensed liquor, and later, narcotics offered quick income where legitimate work barely paid the rent. None of that erased individual choice, but it formed the stage on which his choices played out. He had not been the only young man standing at that crossroads. Others from similar streets went on to become bus drivers, store owners, social workers, soldiers, musicians, and small business operators. He could have been among them. Instead, he turned toward a path that promised not just survival, but dominance. His story also revealed something about the justice system that chased him. The same investigation that brought him down had uncovered officers who had taken payoffs, stolen heroin from evidence lockers and sold it back to dealers, or simply looked the other way in exchange for envelopes. When he agreed to talk, he did not limit his words to his fellow traffickers. He named law enforcement officials who had shaped the playing field itself. Those disclosures were a double-edged blade. On one side, they exposed wrongdoing and forced departments to confront serious internal rot. On the other, they gave a man who had caused great harm a powerful bargaining chip. Many low-level users and sellers in later decades would receive long sentences for possessing much less. He, a major supplier, found a way to walk out of prison earlier than many people expected. That contrast bothered more than a few observers. It raised questions about who pays the highest price when the government declares a war on drugs, and whose cooperation the system is willing to reward. In that sense, his life became a window into the hardest kind of moral problem. What do you do with a man who has both damaged and exposed your society, who has poisoned streets and also helped clean parts of them by revealing what was hidden? He had some answers of his own, late in life, though even those shifted depending on the day. At times, he argued that his cooperation had balanced the scales a little, that helping remove corrupted officers and rival suppliers counted as a form of payback. At other times, especially as his body weakened and the past pressed against him, he admitted that no deal with prosecutors could ever truly settle what his trade had done to thousands of strangers. In quieter moments, far from cameras, he moved away from grand explanations. When grandchildren sat beside him and asked simple questions, "Why did you go to prison? Why did they make a movie about you?" End quote. Why did they make a movie about you? He told simpler truths. He said he had wanted too much, too fast. He said he had believed money would fix everything. He said that in his hunger to prove he mattered in a world that had told him he didn't, he had stepped on people who were already down. What he left behind, in the end, was not wealth or property, but a layered story. Teachers used it to spark discussion about ethics and economics. Activists pointed to it when arguing that you cannot tackle drug abuse with policing alone. You must address the conditions that make trafficking appealing in the first place. Some in law enforcement circles held it up as a reminder that oversight must be constant, because even those tasked with upholding the law can be pulled into profit schemes when large sums of cash move around in the dark. Parents in neighborhoods like the ones where he once operated told their children his story as a warning. They described the glamour people once saw in sharp suits and new cars, then quietly listed the funerals, the court cases, the generations left picking up the pieces. They hoped that by putting a real name and face to those consequences, they might cut through the lure of fast money in a way that abstract lectures never did. The entertainment world, for its part, would likely never let go of his name entirely. Crime stories have always drawn audiences, and his life contained many of the elements that writers and directors find irresistible. Humble beginnings, clever schemes, moral fog, dramatic fall, uneasy redemption. But every time his story was retold on screen or in print, there was an opportunity, a chance for someone to push past the surface details and ask why such a life had seemed so attractive to him in the first place, and what could be done to keep others from standing at the same edge. Late at night, somewhere in a city that still bears the marks of past and present drug epidemics, a young person might lie awake scrolling through clips on a phone. A scene from the movie pops up. A sharply dressed dealer walking through a busy street, people parting around him, respect and fear in their eyes. It looks cool in a quick video. Maybe that same person, a little curious, clicks next on an old interview. The man in the clip is not glamorous. He is wrinkled, sitting in a chair, speaking slowly. He talks about missing his children's growing up years, about sitting for decades in a cell, about people who never got out at all. The energy in his voice when he describes money and power sounds different from the tone he uses for regret. If the listener is paying attention, they can hear the cost hiding under the legend. The story of Frank Lucas does not offer a neat moral where everything balances in the end. Too much damage was done for that. He did not become a saint in old age. He did not suffer a spectacular fate that could be pointed to as instant justice. Instead, he lived long enough to watch his own myth grow and twist, to face children and grandchildren who had to live with his choices, to see cities continue to wrestle with new waves of addiction born from new substances and new forms of exploitation. Maybe the clearest lesson his life offers sits in the gap between how it looked at its peak and how it felt overall. From the outside, at 25 or 35, he seemed to have escaped every limit placed on him by poverty and segregation. From the inside, looking back at 80 plus, what stood out most were the years lost in confinement, the people hurt, the way the empire crumbled overnight when the door finally came crashing in. If there is any use in telling his story as the night wears on and people drift toward sleep, it might be this: to remind anyone listening that a life built on stepping over others, even if the climb begins in real pain and real injustice, does not stay tall forever. The shine fades, the bills come due. The person who once seemed untouchable ends up like everyone else, sitting in doctors' offices, answering to grandchildren, meeting the limits of their own body. Somewhere, in a quiet apartment window not so different from the one where he once sat and watched the city, another aging man looks out at the same streets. He remembers his own smaller choices, shortcuts taken or refused, offers accepted or ignored. He knows he'll never see his name in a headline, never watch an actor pretend to be him on a screen. He is simply one of many whose lives were nudged and shaped by the era when men like Frank Lucas walked those blocks. The city lights flicker, cars pass, kids laugh on the sidewalk, stories from the blink, past hang in the air like faint echoes. Some are cautionary, some are boastful, many are both at once. What the next generation does with them, whether they copy the worst parts, resist them, or learn how to build something better in their place, will decide whether men like Frank Lucas remain central figures in urban legends, or fade into footnotes as other, healthier models of success take their place. For now, his story rests where all human stories eventually go, in the uneasy space between condemnation and understanding, between the harm someone caused and the wounds that shaped them. It is left to those who hear it to decide what to carry forward: a love of the flashy moments, or a deeper respect for the quiet, hard work of building a life that doesn't need to hide from a knock on the door. And with that, we close tonight's chapter of The Silent Empires. Lucky Luciano here, thanking you for walking beside me through the strategy, the ambition, and the quiet power that shaped a new era of the underworld. If this story helped you unwind or drift into sleep, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and stay with us for more tales of gangsters and forgotten empires. Until next time, may the night rest softly over you, and may the echoes of history carry you gently into sleep. Good night.